A very good morning to you. Welcome into today's programme on this Monday morning. Well, last week my next guest was at a conference in NUI Galway, and he detailed some efforts to train young journalists how to spot and deal with misinformation. And I suppose what we've grown accustomed to is fake news. And he joins you on the line. His name is Professor Jim Carney, and he joins me on the line from Lehman College in the Bronx, and he is online with us. Professor, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us today. You have a very broad thought process on this, but fake news and teaching journalists how to determine what is fake and what is true is quite a challenge.
It is, and because people don't really recognize it because it's so pervasive in everything that we see, we hear, and we do. And one of the things we try to get away from too is calling it fake news, because it's an oxymoron. If it's fake, it's not news, and if it's news, then it really shouldn't be fake. So misinformation is the word we try to go with, and basically, it comes down to human instinct. If it's BS and it sounds like BS, it smells like BS. No, I'm not going to go that far. But if it seems like it's BS, then it should raise questions. And it's just that it's so much around us that it's hard to pick those elements of truth. And for young journalists, it's even worse today because of the amount of information that's out there. And that's what's really different now is the amount and the speed at which we're bombarded with information. It's hard to pick out which pieces of news, which pieces of information we get are actually truthful, which are useful, and which are just for lack of a better term, or propaganda or BS.
Can I ask you, though, in relation to social media, and again, I'm a good bit older than you, but I've been a long time in the industry.
I wouldn't know about that, but anyhow, go ahead, okay.
but is it down to social media where in some aspects of life, social media is taken as gospel, and once it's on social media, it's there, where everyone has access to social media, and there's zero controls or zero methods of confirming a story when it's on social media?
Well, nothing is new. If we go back into, like, for example, over this side in American history, you can go back to the Spanish-American War and H. Randolph Hearst, who essentially started a war between the not single-handedly, but his newspapers almost single-handedly started a war between the United States and Spain, blaming the sinking of a ship in Havana Harbor on the Spaniards because he wanted to sell newspapers. Now, were there checks and balances on his newspapers? There were other so-called yellow journalism papers. So my point being is that this is not a new thing. It's something that we've dealt with as long as there's been media. The difference here is the amount and the speed. One of the professors who spoke at the conference last week had an amazing tidbit of information. The human brain can only think at somewhere around 27 miles an hour. I'm not sure what that is in kilometers, but we can't think quicker than that. So if information is coming in quicker than that, we have to pick and choose and sample. So as a result, we don't do the same reasoning. So to answer your question, though, what social media does is it bathes us and saturates our minds with so much information that it kind of overloads us. And unfortunately, what happens is people have a tendency to then retreat to what they're comfortable with and what they already agree with. And that's where we have in this country the phenomenon of Fox News. They tune in not because they want to be convinced of something, but because they want to be reassured and reaffirmed that their opinion's right. And that's essentially what Fox does, and on the right as well, on the left as well. I'm sorry, across the spectrum. So to answer your question, it's a matter of degree, and Ultimately the ultimate arbitrator here, or the determiner of truth, is ourselves. And the more that we can get informed critically, the better we are to accept that information and interpret it.
But there is, I'm speaking to Professor Jim Carney, but there is a hunger out there. I mean, with everything that's out there, there's a hunger across all age groups for information. And some people just like to take the negative rather than the positive, and take what's been fed to them rather than trying to verify it, but they take as fact that X, Y, and Z happened. From a young journalist, and when you're training young journalists, how do you, because this is what they've grown up with, but how do you educate them in such a way that they don't go down that path and they try to verify as best as they can?
Well, it's a matter of training and discipline, but at the same time, it's common sense. So what we try to do is just give them tools that they can use that, I'm not going to say it makes it simpler, but it might make it easier to check on things. And there's a number of tools that are out there. In this country, for example, there's a place called the Pointer Institute, which I encourage people to check out. And they have one thing that they can do is they can sign up for it's actually a tutorial or a mini class that's free, and every day they get a little quiz, and then based on their answer, they get a text back with a video talking about different aspects of how to spot, for lack of a better term, fake news, like how to look at what are called deep fakes. Those are the videos that are doctored to make it look like a politician or a celebrity is in a situation that they really aren't. Or how do you talk to family and friends over the holiday table when they say something that you know is obviously a fabrication, rather than saying you're wrong? How do you talk to them and encourage them to think about it and maybe, well, who said that? And did anybody else say that? And did you like look to see if this? So these are common sense steps that have always been there. That we just if you were looking up sports stats, and someone says that this particular soccer player or has a certain number of goals and it sounds ridiculous, the first thing you're going to do now is go to a credible source of sport or some other news source that is generally reliable, and say, no, that's not right. Excuse me. So it is a matter of common sense and using tools that we have. And social media, even though it is overwhelming, does provide us with a lot of tools and a lot of ways to check things out.
Can I ask you though about libel and slander when it comes to this? Because in this country here in Ireland, libel and slander is, it's enshrined in law, so it is. But social media is not covered, and the OSMR bill that's currently going through the Dáil will put paid to that. But what is the situation in the USA when it comes to going onto social platforms like we're talking about, the misinformation that we're talking about, and when it comes to libel and slander?
Libel and slander in this country are, as you said, there's much more leeway to be able to say things about a public figure, and there are sliding scales as to what constitutes a public figure. But there has been a move, particularly on our former president's part, on Donald Trump's part, to try and basically folks who are his allies have tried to lobby and have the laws come closer to what historically you've seen over there.
Yeah.
In terms of making it easier to sue, or to challenge in court what's been said. The danger there is that people with lots of resources generally are in a position where they can silence people with money. They can take them to court and keep them tied up in court until they run out. The people who are publishing run out of money. So the courts in this particular, and on our side, what they've done is they've come up with ways that courts can basically say, well, no, we're getting out of hand now, whether it be a judge or a jury will determine that now you're getting into the area of suing, not to protect your reputation, but to put people out of business. So historically, the press has had a longer leash, shall we say, to make claims, and part of the payment for power and for authority is that you open your lives to scrutiny, and you have to deal with these sorts of things. So historically, it's generally worked, but the tide is swinging in the opposite direction now, where people that can lobby in Washington, D.C. or in state capitals are now trying to change these laws to make it easier to sue and silence voices. And unfortunately, it's those smaller news outlets. It's the local newspapers where you can still find them, unfortunately, or radio stations. Local radio stations are the ones that very often come up with these bits of information and these news stories that expose problems that exist with famous people or politicians, and it is part of the process. If you want to get rich and famous, then you have to be prepared to bear the scrutiny of the public, and it's worked with the American legal system, and hopefully it'll stay that way.
Can I ask you, during your stay in Ireland, I mean, you have a very good grasp of the Irish media as well. Are we totally different to that of the USA?
I would say not. The trends are still the same. We're seeing the loss of the newspaper, but I always tell when students come and say, what am I going to do for a living? Why am I bothering to be a journalist when there's going to be no jobs? And it's simply not true. Instead of thinking of a newspaper as a document that shows up at your doorstep every morning, you have to change that concept and think of the reputation behind that newspaper and what it represents. And the New York Times has done a very good job at that in this country. The New York Times has more reporters now on staff than they have had in their entire history. And I'm one of the few who still gets the Sunday paper delivered to my front doorstep. But they're thought of as a news organization as opposed to a newspaper. And I think that's happening in Ireland. I think that's happening across the world. And the important part is for news organizations to consider themselves not newspapers, but news organizations. And that's happening there. I see radio stations, internet radio stations popping up, which are creating outlets. So we're not going to be seeing the superstar news presenters that we've seen in the past. What we will see is many more smaller operations where journalists can provide a lot more information. The problem for the consumers of news, whether it be in Ireland or in the States or in the Philippines, which is undergoing an immense problem now with their media, is to be able to filter through. There's so much there. It used to be you couldn't find that straw, that piece of hay. Now it's finding that needle of fact in the haystack. That's the problem. And I think that's pretty much universal, because these barriers are falling because of telecommunication and because of electronic media. But at the same time, the common problems, elements, and solutions don't know borders. Borders are artificial. There are artificial barriers that we have put up to try and contain groups of people, but they fall in terms of modern media and concepts and conversation and communication. So the important part here is to keep the conversations open, and that crosses all borders.
Professor Jim Carney, thank you so much for joining us from Lehman College in the Bronx. Thank you for taking your call this morning, and hopefully you get back to Ireland again in the near future.
You're not going to keep me away. I have family over there. I had a wonderful time connecting with family, looking into my roots up in Mayo, and it's extraordinarily satisfying. So I'll be back.
Well, we look forward to welcoming you to Galway, but thank you indeed for taking our call on this Monday morning, and a very good morning to you. That's Professor Jim Carney joining us on the line.